This is Madia-as Digdigan Buenaflor, extending an invitation to each and every one of you everywhere, as my way of commemorating the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. I will read and serialize my novel, The Blood of Three, starting on Tuesday, August 27, and continuing episodes on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Follow the drama on my YouTube channel. May we forever exhale and inhale love and peace. Alone by himself, Mr. Miura sat on his rocking chair, the chair steady now. He just sat there, not moving, just staring, not thinking. His mind had grown tired from the strain. It had become numbed from the shock. The realization of Joybell's death started to sink in. From the time he buried his daughter on his hill beside Lota's grave that morning, Mr. Miura had done nothing but sit there, totally detached priest of the world. The tragic incident left him so suddenly lost, deserted. It now came back to him like a dark cloud, engulfing him into a kind of limbo. He hanging to nothingness, suspended indefinitely in mid-air, not knowing when the last thread would break and plunge him down into oblivion. Painful reality was tearing him apart, gnawing into his heart. He now hesitatingly grasped its full impact, that Joybell was gone forever, lying cold there in her grave, still and quiet, never to return to him again. Now his whole world seemed no longer to form part of him, his mind no longer comprehending his perceptions. His heart had momentarily become callous and unfeeling. His eyes drained dry from tears. The eyes had sagged down. His face suddenly wrinkled. Even his shoulders, which had always been firm, broad and erect, had shrunk and drooped. He had aged overnight. That morning he was alone, carrying on his shoulder Joybell's coffin. He told no one about his great loss, for he did not want to allow anyone to intrude into his grief. Yet, in spite of his self-imposed isolation, a child who saw him in that heart-rending trailed behind him. One by one, they formed a procession. The children and some their elders, most of them Japanese. Many of the Filipino civilians had already been hoarded at the marketplace. Soon the hill darkened with bowed heads. They all came to bid Joybell goodbye and to offer their prayers. Even in the midst of the crowd, Mr. Miura was alone. He just stood there, seeming not to sense the presence of friends. His face was pale and tense, his eyes red and hollow, his jaws clamped and his fists tightly clasping together, as if squeezing out all his pent-up emotions that had been resisting to leave him. The sobbing of the women and the wailing of the children only then made him aware that others were grieving as well. He raised his head and looked around, stopping at its face, capturing the grief that was painfully etched there. And as his eyes returned to the cross on Joybell's grave, his grief burst out like a dam, and he screamed and cried unashamedly. Only then did he realize once again how death had robbed him of everything dear to him. He plunged himself over Joybell's grave, calling her, asking her to rise and go home with him, and pleading to her not to leave him alone. Michi came after the rest of the civilians had gone, and Mr. Miura was left alone. He came with his flowers and his ukulele, the only thing he possessed in which Joybell found a childlike fancy. Like his silent love for Joybell, Michi wept silently for her. He and Mr. Miura did not talk. They just looked at each other with sympathy and unspoken grief. He stood there for some time, praying fervently, perhaps hoping to please Joybell for the last time. He started to strum his ukulele. Every note seemed to weep for the girl he deeply loved. But before he could finish the melody, he turned away and ran down the hill, sobbing. Mr. Miura remembered that scene vividly. He felt the great loss of Michi, for he was once young like him and had loved secretly as Michi had. For several hours, Mr. Miura stayed at the grave alone until his body was parched by the scourging heat of the noonday sun. The sun was directly above Ernesto and he cast no shadow. He looked at his watch. It was 12 noon. He had his rendezvous with Joybell. Hiding himself behind the twin rocks, he could not help but feel a knot in his gut. Joybell should come any time now, and she would have the information they needed. The new developments in their plans made Ernesto even more anxious. Just before Ernesto left the camp, he was summoned by Colonel Holt for an emergency conference on the message they received from General MacArthur's headquarters, asking for their clearance that evening for the projected mass landing of the Allied forces at the beaches of Luzon early the next morning. Ernesto knew that until they took hold of the sketch, they could not give such clearance, nor could they hope to pave the way safely for the landing forces. He had been waiting for over an hour and the tension was almost killing him. He refused to be pessimistic about their mission, but the delay of Joybell gave him no small amount of apprehension about its ultimate success. Unable to wait any longer and wanting desperately to find out for himself what had happened to Joybell and her mission, Ernesto decided to alter their previous arrangement. He would get close to Miura's house and hopefully ask someone to deliver a note to her. He suspected that the situation in the town must be that tense for Joybell to miss their appointment. Hurriedly, Ernesto left the twin rocks and following a rarely trodden trail toward the town, he walked the distance, his mind in a state of confusion and anxiety. Upon entering the town and sneaking beneath the seemingly empty houses, he sensed the eerie silence pervading all over the place. There was an obvious absence of civilians, an increased absence of checkpoints, which made the house of Joybell inaccessible without passing through the checkpoints, including the road behind them. There was a drastic change in the Japanese security since the Sunday he was there. The town looked deserted, except for the menacing presence of Japanese soldiers all over. Suddenly, the place became a ghost town. He decided to continue on crouching under and around the huts until he reached a point where he could see the Miura's hut, but there was no way he could reach it, not with the vigilance of the soldiers. From the direction of the market, he heard the groaning of what sounded like hundreds of voices. He realized that what the Japanese had done to the civilians. Now the fear that Joybell and Mr. Miura were among those in concentration gripped him. A soft treading sound on the asphalt road made him turn, and he was relieved to see a small Japanese girl getting nearer to where he was. The girl was escaping and rolling a ball made of wooden palm leaves. He hurriedly wrote on the small sheet of paper he had with him. Then he waited. As the child got nearer, he softly called her attention. The guard heard the sound and looked around. Ernesto lay flat on the ground. The child had not heard him. Again, Ernesto tried by throwing a small pebble on her direction. The child turned only to step back upon seeing him. He was sweating, concerned that the child might call the guard, but instead she just stood there staring at him. Ernesto fished out from his pocket a couple of Japanese paper bills and showed her. Still the child just stared. Ernesto motioned for the child to come, smiling and showing the money. After looking back at the checkpoint, she finally moved toward him. As soon as the child neared him, he pulled her away from the sight of the guard, at the same time hushing her to keep quiet. He took her behind the hut and in a low, gentle voice asked her if she could do him a favor. "I'll give you this money if you'll help me," Ernesto explained slowly in Japanese. The child brightened, her eyes focused on the paper bills. "You give me money to buy food?" she asked him excitedly. Yes, all this money I give you if you do something for me." "Something? What something?" Listen carefully and remember everything I say. He was holding the child by the shoulders. The child nodded. "You give this paper to that house." Ernesto pointed to the hut of the Miuras. "You see that house with banana plants?" The child nodded again. "All right then, you bring this paper and give it to Lady." Ernesto decided not to give Joybell's name for fear of the consequence in case the guard got hold of the child and questioned her, or worse, got hold of the note. "Give me money." The child's eyes did not leave the paper bills. "Here, I'll give you this money as soon as you come back. Now listen. You give this paper and stay there. You wait for answer, then come back here. Then I give this money to you. Understand?" The child at first looked at him with knitted brows, then smiled and nodded. She grabbed the paper and was about to skip away when Ernesto pulled her back. "Why?" The child stammered, suddenly caught with fear. "I'm sorry if I frightened you, but you can't just carry this in your hand." The child looked at him without saying anything. Ernesto smiled and the child smiled back. "May I borrow your ball?" The child first hesitated, but as Ernesto showed her the money, she handed him his ball. "I'll pay for this." Ernesto parted the wooden palm ball and inserted the folded paper inside it, then smoothed the ball again. "Here, take this ball to that house. Tell Lady there is something inside the ball, okay?" The child nodded. Ernesto kissed her on the forehead. Twinkles appeared in her eyes as he skipped away. Ernesto nervously watched the child skip back to the street, rolling her ball once again, but the ball rolled instead toward the checkpoint. Ernesto held his breath. He looked back for a possible escape route in case the note was discovered and his hiding place pinpointed. The guard picked up the ball and gave it to the Japanese child and patted her head. The child bowed and continued to skip, rolling her ball until he reached the Miura's house. That entire morning and afternoon, Mr. Miura had not left his rocking chair, just sitting quietly, not thinking. He had not eaten at all. He shut his eyes, wanting to be alone with the memories of his loved ones in that small hut they called home. He had imposed on himself a period of deep solitary mourning for the successive loss of the two people dearest to him. He did not hear the first soft knocking at the door. Several more rapid knocks followed, and it was only then that Mr. Miura blinked his eyes, stood and almost mechanically walked to the closed door. He opened it without any sign of anticipation nor concern. "For Lady," the small child handed her ball to him. He just stared down at her, still with a passive look. "For Lady," the child insisted. Something inside looked. The child pried open two strips of the wooden palm. Mr. Miura's eyes widened as he saw a sheet of paper inside the bowl. He suddenly became interested. "Give it to me." He practically snatched the paper from the child and hurriedly read it. "Who gave this to you?" Anxiety was visible on his face. "Man, there." The child pointed to the direction of houses across the checkpoints. He pulled the child inside the house and closed the door. The child must have been new to the town, for he hasn't seen her before. Apparently, part of the new Japanese families that were moved in from the adjacent vicinities. "Wait here," he told the child, then read the note again, this time much more slowly. "Place a sketch inside the bowl. It will reach me. We'll use it tonight. Don't come to me. A drawing of a heart and an E." Mr. Miura felt like he was hit by lightning with the realization that the note might have come from Ernesto and presumably meant for Joybell. The note was for the lady, the child said. It was for Joybell. He suddenly recalled the last word of Joybell, to give her locket to Ernesto. Hyperventilating, he took out the locket from his pocket and without delay opened it. There he saw the folded paper, and unfolding it, he found the sketch of the catacomb of the church and its armory. This discovery shocked him. Now he knew what happened to Joybell. She risked herself entering the garrison and the church to help Ernesto. My God, what have I done to my daughter? I refused Ernesto, but she defied me to help him. Now he was certain that it was a Japanese, maybe one of the new arrivals who ravaged and murdered her daughter. The truth was strangling him. Her daughter kept all this from him. She must have figured that by helping the guerrilla movement, it may hasten the end of the war. He was blind. He was a coward. Joybell showed more courage and conviction than him. She took the risk because no one else was willing to do it, including her own father. His mind was in a turmoil. Was it because of the death of her mother that she decided all of this had to end? Yes, this war had gone too long and taken countless lives that even a young girl had decided to do something at all costs, including giving up her life. He mumbled between gritted teeth, "If an innocent girl of 16 had seen this truth, why can't he?" He clenched his fist. He thought of the death of Lota in a Filipino's hand and the fate of Joybell in the Japanese. Finally, he saw the urgency for action. His thought was disrupted by the rattling of machine guns, followed by hair-raising cries and then silence. He raced to the window. A chill ran through his veins. My God, they have killed the civilians. Mr. Miura could hardly hear his own voice. A few hours ago, some of those civilians were present at the burial of his daughter. The scene suddenly flashed back. The coffin of Joybell was just being covered with soil when a truckload of Japanese soldiers barged into their midst and without further ceremony gathered the few remaining Filipino civilians, women and children, leaving only the few Japanese civilians and himself. Their screams shattered the mournful silence as the civilians were dragged away and dumped into the truck. Mr. Miura closed the windows as if shutting off the ugliness he desperately wanted to block from his mind. But this time he knew he could not run away anymore, for everything in that little hut reminded him of Joybell. The horrible ways he died, and the noble and selfless sacrifice he did for the sake of peace. He saw how this once beautiful world, which Joybell loved so much, was breaking into thousands of unmendable little pieces because people like him did not lift a finger to try to do something about him. Much as he loved peace, there came a time that one has to fight in order to have peace and freedom from those who fought to destroy this. He had decided to help, not to fight and kill, but to help so people could live. He would continue and finish what her daughter had started and give meaning to Joybell's death. He could not allow her dying for nothing. A fire was rekindled in Mr. Miura's heart, the long subdued yet innate fiery sentiment of a true samurai. Once more Mr. Miura looked at the sketch and studied it carefully. Now he remembered the tunnel and he was sure he could be of great help to the guerrillas. He still vividly recalled how he was summoned to the garrison just a week after they arrived in that town almost 3 years ago. News reached the Japanese top brass that he was an expert in masonry work, and so like any loyal Japanese, he accepted the job entrusted to him. He was assigned to reinforce the catacomb beneath the church, for it was to be used as the armory. Toward the completion of the job, he noticed a beam of light coming out from one of the tombstones on the wall of the catacomb. He still remembered where that particular tombstone was, for he sailed around the marble slab after he explored what was behind it. It was a long tunnel that led toward the outskirts of the walled fortress. He knew exactly where its entrance was, for he got out of it after breaking through the thick bushes that concealed its opening for years. He was sure then that no one has found what he had inadvertently discovered. He decided that no one else has to know of its existence, and just to reassure himself that it remained a secret, that evening he went back to the location and sealed the entrance by blocking it with a moss-covered boulder and replaced the aged bushes that he had earlier disturbed. At the time, it never occurred to him that one day, this piece of information could enable him to finish his daughter's commitment to the early restoration of peace. Mr. Miura's decision was final. He would help the guerrillas and accomplish what her daughter had started. He remembered having promised her that he would be there for her and vice versa. This was their last conversation a few days back as they walked home from the debacle that resulted from their help at the market concentration site. He knew what the guerrillas intended to do with the tunnel. With everything set in his mind, he wrote a note at the back of the sketch and affixed his signature. As much as he wanted to inform Ernesto of Joybell's passing, he thought it was unwise to burden him with the news before undertaking an important and dangerous mission. Carefully, Mr. Miura replaced the sketch inside the ball. He approached the child who was squatting on the floor and playing with an imaginary friend. "You are a good child," he spoke to her in Japanese. "Now go back. Give this ball to your friend." Mr. Miura patted the child's head and told her to go. The child ran down the stairs and, like before, skipped through the street, playing with her ball. Mr. Miura anxiously peeped through the windows and watched as the child neared the checkpoint. A loud screech from a speeding truck almost made Mr. Miura scream, for the child was on the path of the truck, and were it not for timely braking, the child would have been run over. He uttered a prayer of thanks as he saw the child safe with the ball still in her hand. The frightened child scampered away as fast as he could toward the direction of the shack where Ernesto was hiding. Only then was Mr. Miura able to take his eyes off the child and follow the now speeding truck. His hair stood on end as he saw the pile of the dead civilians in the truck. He could only close his eyes and pound his fist against the windowsill. As soon as Ernesto got the paper from the child, he gave her the money and anxiously unfolded the paper. Ernesto's face brightened upon seeing the information they needed. Everything was just perfect. The tunnel led to the underground armory, and no guard was stationed inside the armory itself, except for the two outside its door. They have a good chance of entering the tunnel undetected, and a snake attack could catch these enemies by surprise. As Ernesto folded the sketch, he saw the note which read, "You may use the tunnel. I'll clear the way for you tonight. After the changing of the guard, watch for my signal entrance around midnight, Mr. Miura." Ernesto went over the note again and again and wondered why it was Mr. Miura who had sent it instead of Joybell. He was still confused why Mr. Miura had decided to help after he had vehemently refused him. But with time running out, Ernesto had no interest to debate the issue. He figured it was possible that Joybell could have convinced her father, considering how much Mr. Miura loved her. And maybe, because of his life's death, he finally acceded to extend his help. Right now, however, Ernesto did not want to second guess. He got what he wanted, and that was good enough for him. Ernesto's pace had never been this fast, sprinting through the winding path to the mountain. He felt very light and elated at Mr. Miura's help, which he considered his acceptance into their family. He could not help but smile with excitement, just thinking of asking for the hands of Joybell in marriage from Mr. Miura when the war was over. He would not have to deal with in-laws problems, nor foresee any. It would be a perfect happy union. Joybell would be an ideal and loving wife to him. What they had the previous day would always remain a cherished part of their lives. Ernesto knew down deep in his heart that he could only love and marry one woman, the woman he wanted to be the mother of his children, Joybell. He felt something very sacred in the love they felt for each other. Ernesto's beautiful thoughts of Joybell had made his long trek seem so much shorter. She had provided him with the magic that made him fly. He eagerly anticipated the final accomplishment of their one last important mission, for it would mean the early end of the war, and the end of the war meant his reunion with his Joybell for life. That's all for today, to be continued on Tuesdays and Thursdays. May we all forever exhale and inhale love and peace. Thanks for being with me today. I hope you will inspire me with a like, share, and subscribe.